Hello and welcome to India Speak, a podcast by the Center for Policy Research. I'm Rohan Venkat. You're listening to CPR Perspectives, a special series commemorating CPR's 50th anniversary, where we bring you one flagship conversation with a CPR faculty member every month. This month, we have Avani Kapur, a senior fellow at CPR, where she also leads the Accountability Initiative, which has pioneered research on India's public welfare system and gone the extra mile in ensuring its findings reach government officials, academics, and citizens. Avani has been at CPR since 2008, beginning as a research associate and working her way up to lead the Accountability Initiative. Along the way, she has led key process and fund tracking surveys on vital social sector schemes and also set up Pulse for Development, which brings onto the same platform more than 90 organizations within the development community dedicated to citizen-centric policies and implementation. I spoke to Avani about the stunning examples of inefficiency she discovered while looking for bottlenecks in public spending in the field, how one government official described the Accountability Initiative's work as being that of a physician tracking the flow of blood through the body searching for blockages, and why the initiative has shifted from talking about accountability to focusing on responsive governance. Thank you so much for being here, Avani. We have lots to get into, and I think we'll try and get a broad sense of both your own personal journey in the policy space as well as with the Accountability Initiative. But I'd like to start there. I'd like to get a sense of how you entered policy in the first place. Did you always know you were going to be going down this road? Is it something that you sort of stumbled into and ended up in? Could you tell us a little bit about your background well before CPR?
Thanks, Rohan. Great to be doing this. So I was studying history in LSR, the Lady Shri Ram College in New Delhi, and I was really loving it. I had great teachers for history right from school who didn't just focus on the memorization of dates or names, and that's a typical thing that people think about when they think about studying history, but instead about the narratives and stories around different events. All my teachers had promoted this sense of inquisitiveness and curiosity and asking questions and not just taking anything on at face value. However, when I got the opportunity to go to a liberal arts college in America, this was after I had completed 2 years at LSR, I decided to take that up just because I wanted exposure to different topics. I think I felt that I was a bit too naive and young to decide a stream. And one of the advantages of a liberal arts degree is that I could take up courses on art history, on biology, philosophy, astronomy, even dance or music, a wide range, and that allowed me to actually explore different courses. So even when people were wondering, well, you only have 1 year to complete an LSR, I do think that I made the right decision because the exposure that I got in the liberal arts college that I went to Smith College definitely paved the way for the journey that I've taken in the policy space. I remember it was during this time when I was at Smith that took a course on economic policy. And I think just taking that course, I realized that I had an interest in this field and I wanted to do more in the development space. In fact, during the summer vacations, I applied for a research grant and managed to do internships with a microfinance organization in one break, as well as a research organization in another break. When I completed college, unfortunately in India during that time, there were no real public policy schools. And most of the development policy courses in the US were focused much more on IR, international relations, or at best international development. But I knew that I wanted to work on India-related issues, and so I decided to pursue the development studies at the London School of Economics and Political Science, or LSE. And I think the coursework there, but more importantly, just being in the heart of London, where you have numerous scholars coming to visit and give lectures, cemented my decision to work in the public policy space. And I think when I returned back to India, that's where I got my first working opportunity of working in a small research organization started by Dr. Arjun Sengupta, who was then a member of parliament as well. It was called the Center for Development and Human Rights. And Dr. Sengupta himself was a special rapporteur to the UN on extreme poverty and the right to development. So I got to understand some of the rights and welfare literature there. I think I spent about 2 years there, and then I felt strongly that Athara, understanding of welfare required not just sitting in front of a desk in Delhi, but actually making my way to the realities of the field. I think that was this. I was starting to get a little frustrated about not being able to actually go to the field in that job. And I think luckily at that time I connected with Yamni and decided to join her in the new initiative she was in the process of conceptualizing called the Accountability Initiative. And 15 years later, it feels almost surreal that I'm now leading that initiative, and I've been with CPR and AI for the last since 2008, so 15 years.
Yeah, uh, that's fascinating, and I think we'll come to AI in a moment. But I'm curious about some of those moments on the past. One, moving from history to economics, which from one sense makes a lot of sense, but also I think it's not very common there to go from that world of narratives to maybe a bit more of numbers. And I'm curious how those two things play together. And then down the line, you picked LSE, but was there any point where you thought you might be looking at academics proper? Was it always clear to you in your head that you'd be going into you wouldn't be staying in the academy and you'd be looking at more practicing outside? I'm just curious, what were you thinking?
So I think the shift from history to economics, so one of the best parts of the liberal arts college is that I was able to do a minor in economics. In fact, I could have done a double major, which is what I was contemplating at one point, but then ended up doing the Latin honors. So that gave me the ability to do a course across the different sciences as well. So I think that interest in economics was always there. But the idea of combining history and economics, actually, I find that a natural kind of way, a natural simulation in some ways, because in economics, it's not just about numbers. There is now growing, so even the economic field has grown so much now from behavior economics to economic policy, economic history. And I think that the ability to not just take numbers at face value, but try and go dig deeper to understand the why, pushes you to understand people, it pushes you to understand events. And that's what history also teaches us. So I think that for me, that was a very, very natural transition, and I don't even actually see it as a transition. Um, I think initially after my master's, I wasn't sure. I knew that I didn't want to immediately pursue higher studies. I felt like I needed to kind of put all my theoretical understanding to use. At that time, I remember I did my LSE dissertation. I was influenced a lot by Albert Hirschman's Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, and ended up writing my dissertation on urban poverty and governance using his framework and studying city plans and poverty. And I was feeling again frustrated that one thing is to kind of theorize, to come up with frameworks, but actually see something with your own eyes and actually work towards it. In terms of resolving some of the challenges is something that was always in me. And so I was sure that I didn't want to immediately go for higher studies. I think I've had moments where I felt that maybe I should do a PhD um, over the last 15 years, even at CPR, and I've spoken to a number of people. But at the same time, I think a lot of the niche that I've built, it has been a lot of on ground and self learning and the presence of multiple mentors. So I've been lucky that way to have that kind of exposure that allows me to kind of push myself and learn new methods even within the workspace. So I'm still not saying never. One may go down that route. More just from taking a break and trying to figure out what next. But I'm not there yet. So right now I'm still quite embedded and quite passionate about being in the practitioner world.
Got it. And so that brings us to 2008, as you say that accountability initiative was just starting to be conceptualized at the time. So tell us a little bit about that. What was the idea there? Again, I'm interested by the fact that the motivation to some extent was not just theorizing, and also in the previous organization you were at about getting a chance to do fieldwork. So I'm curious how that then leads into AI. But yes, so how did this come together?
So it was literally written in the stars. I remember Yamni was setting this up. I had met her previously when I was still, I think, at LSC. And when she was setting it up, she was looking for people. So she had circulated terms of reference. I think what I found exciting about the terms of reference in some ways was there was a lot of discovery. So nothing was fully fixed. It was in that early stage of conceptualization. Um, there was a clear idea of what, there was to some degree an idea of what accountability initiative would work on, but it was still very much a work in progress. There was no website yet. There was no logo yet. I think um, it was it was something that it was new and exciting, and I felt like that gave me the chance to explore and learn a lot more on the job. Um, I think when I first joined, the whole idea behind accountability initiative was that it came against the backdrop of a significant political moment in India. So in some ways, India was at the cusp of building the foundations of a right-based welfare state. You saw an expansion of legislation in key areas of social policy, the right to work on Narega being a prime example. And you also saw a lot of enhancement in government's financial incentives, in investments in social policy. And what was interesting about this moment was that this expansion, in some ways, was driven through this unique alliance between civil society organizations, on one hand, the judiciary on the other, and members of the political elite. But what was also very different in some ways about the movement, and in some ways at the heart of this rights-based welfare project, was this vision of transforming the dynamics of citizen-state engagement. So the idea of empowering citizens to place claims on the state and demand accountability for implementation. So you saw a lot of the new legislation and many of the new anti-poverty schemes that were launched by the government during this phase built into them procedural requirements that asked for greater transparency and created spaces for citizen engagement. So this was, for example, use of like various accountability mechanisms like social accountability, social audits were made mandatory under NREGA, the use of right to information, and many of the schemes started talking about the need and importance of participatory bottom-up planning. Yet, I think despite this proliferation of social accountability efforts, there was no analytical framework for understanding and evaluating the effectiveness of these efforts. And that's kind of against the backdrop that AI began its work. And in some ways, the focus of the work was kind of split into two aspects. So one strategy was to build a research base, and the focus here was to study the unfolding and actual implementation of these new accountability mechanisms, particularly the RTI and social audit. So I think, as Yamini would often say, it's like it's about unpacking the implications of this accountability moment and documenting this new accountability landscape. This was research that tried to understand the citizen-state interactions through these accountability mechanisms, and Yamini was mainly leading that work. But the second strategy, and which is what interested me, and that's where I got most involved, was to develop partnerships to actively engage with the nuts and bolts of implementing social accountability. So our primary focus, we started off thinking about education, and to do this, we partnered with Pratham and Asar Center, where we initiated an intervention which aimed at strengthening parental participation in elementary schools in a district in Madhya Pradesh through participatory planning. Our work at MP, and in particular that direct engagement with community participation monitoring, meant that every month for a year almost, I would end up going to Sihor district, spending time in the field, spending time talking to people, trying to understand what the roles and responsibilities of these parent communities are, and trying to kind of help develop collectively this ideal plan in some ways. And so this was about 2008, 2009, 2010. And I think through that exercise, what we soon realized was that the nuances of government functioning at the local level, whether it's resource allocation structures, decision-making structures, fund flows, they end up being a critical bottleneck for effectiveness of these social accountability instruments. So in Madhya Pradesh, in fact, one of the villages that I was working in, the delays in fund flows to schools severely constrained the school's ability to plan, and even they never got the money that they had planned for. And as a result, these delays ended up creating a sharp disincentive for citizen engagement and planning. But what was also interesting is that it also undermined the capability of the local administration to respond to the pressures of citizens laying accountability claims. So most of the officials at the local level that we were speaking to, even if they were willing to help, they simply lacked the information or the decision-making authority to address the problem and facilitate actions based on school needs. So that was our journey. Like I said, it allowed me to get a first-hand experience of how implementation works. And in some ways, it was this experience that led us to launch one of our flagship interventions called PESA.
Yes, and we'll get to PESA in a moment, but I want to come back to these partnerships and to what you were saying about the nuances of the government funding setup. So if we could explain a little bit more for the audience, like when you say there are bottlenecks, and this will play into the conversation we'll have also about the term accountability and so on. I think that the idea that people have in their minds often, at least in a certain segment, particularly in the cities and so on, we tend to think of the money that's flowing down as being bottlenecked not by procedural matters but bureaucratic corruption, by inefficiency, that sort of thing. But I want to know, what do you mean? Why is what is undermining the capability of those on the ground? What are the reasons that this money is not getting there? What did you find?
So first of all, when government is making plans or budgets, they're often making it with incomplete information. So even within the government structures, they don't always have information on what is actually utilized. For the union government, the second they release money, for them it's expenditure. But what actually happens with that money is something that particularly then was not captured. There have been some innovations now, but I'm speaking about 2010, 2009, where there was very little information about how much of that 100 rupees was actually spent and on what. So that was one bottleneck. So when you're making your plans and you're trying to um, suppose like you're trying to create these need-based plans that are done through a bottom-up process, you're doing this, you're functioning without actually knowing how much money you are going to get in that year and how much you will be able to spend. I think the problem definitely starts at the planning stage. Once you've made the plan, there's an entire approval process. And it's often the case that what you ask for is not approved. Part of it is, of course, that we know that there is a budget constraint, but it does mean that so if I've asked for 100 rupees and 60 rupees gets approved, I need to figure out how am I going to divide that 60, because in an ideal way, in an ideal scenario, if I'd done my planning right, I would have been able to know exactly where that 40 was meant to go. But if that 40 doesn't come, how do I rationalize and how do I decide how to allocate that money? We've also seen that there are just administrative bottlenecks. So in one state where we were studying, just at the state level, the Sarkari file, as it were, had to move through 32 desks, all seeking approval and kind of trying to capture the corruption question. So in some ways, you've got a system of inefficiency in an attempt to capture leakage, but it's actually leading to a lot more problems in terms of service delivery on the ground. You also have a situation where when money comes, so think of it this way: if money comes, so first is the planning process. So I didn't get what I want, and I got something else. This decision making is highly centralized. So we have visited schools in Bihar which didn't have a school building, but there was some order that was passed that every school had to have fire extinguishers. So even buildingless schools had to get fire extinguishers in their school. So imagine a teacher had to kind of lug this fire extinguisher every day back and forth from the school just because someone had passed this order saying that every single school is, irrespective of need, had to get a fire extinguisher. Then you have a situation where money doesn't come or comes really late. We've seen schools that even when there were annual grants that were meant to come, either some lag in paperwork or somewhere the bank account numbers didn't match, but the money just never came in that fiscal year. Or when it came, I've seen a number of schools that got money, for instance, on the 30th of March or 31st of March, literally 1 or 2 days before the financial year is meant to end. So now what does the school do? If it doesn't spend the money, then it has to, then A, you'll be wrapped in the knuckles, but more importantly, sometimes so the school ends up making decisions of trying to spend not necessarily on what they need, but on what is faster. So I remember going and visiting a large number of schools, and what was amazing was that pretty clean looking buildings were regularly getting whitewashed. And when we spoke to people, we realized that that's one of the easiest ways to spend that money. You whitewash the building so it looks nice. Um, and at the same time, that way you are able to show your utilization, but it still may not be actually what you need, because maybe that school didn't have a boundary wall or didn't have a toilet facility, but well, that all of those take time. They have their own administrative red tape, so this is something easier to do. The other big things that we've seen in terms of some of these bottlenecks was that often there is the person who is being held accountable for an action doesn't always have the authority to undertake that action. And that's always this big um, kind of, we call this like spider web of governance, where you have different people who are on paper meant to be accountable for different activities, but when you start looking at, do they have the authority, do they have the autonomy to make decisions that would enable that accountability, you find that that's not the case. There's a lot of informal networks that are sometimes stronger than what's written on paper, which actually impact how services get delivered. So these are the some examples of the bottlenecks that we've seen when we've been doing this some of our PESA work. But I'm happy to get into a little bit more detail later on in the conversation.
Yeah, no, I mean each one of those super interesting, from 32 desks to lugging around fire extinguishers to whitewashing clean walls. Again, and I think it nuances this idea again that for many that the money, is not getting there just because someone's taking a cut or it's being wasted or put into somebody's pocket, that sort of thing. I think there's clearly like a sense there's much more to it than that. Maybe an outsider's question here. I'm curious at the very genesis level. You're saying government didn't have a good sense of when it sends this 100 rupees to this school, what is actually happening with that money. 50, 60 years into the setup of this welfare state that we have, and also the existence, by this point of organizations like CPR and others for a while. Why weren't we tracking these things already? Like, I don't know if it's a naive question, but for an outsider who's not as familiar with this world, was it a capacity thing? Is it a new approach that sort of came in vogue around this time, or alongside, as you said earlier, the rights-based framework? What explains it now, and why wasn't it already there?
So I won't say that everything is there even now. It's the fact that we still have government coming to us and asking us to help find these bottlenecks and help provide them information about what's happening on the ground means that even today there is a lacuna of information that exists. I think part of the reason that we found is that anything below the national level, data is just not standardized. And so you have departments that are not able to necessarily share data with each other. There's a lot of data as a country in India that we collect, but very few people are actually using that data, checking the quality of that data, and actually taking decisions on that data. So I think that I don't think that we have fully valued what all data could be used for. So it's still viewed very much as a monitoring tool, but the degree to which having disaggregated data could actually help in service delivery, could actually help in planning, is still relatively new in the country, in our country. So I do think that it is to a large degree a function of capacity. Even now, we've been studying, for instance, data entry operators that collect a lot of data and are responsible for filling information and management information systems, and which have a lot of actually ground up granular data. But they don't have the infrastructure in place. They don't really fully have computer training in place. So there is a strong capacity gap at the local level, both in terms of data collection, but also data interpretation and data use. At the national level, I do think that I guess it's a question of what are we measuring and what do we want to measure. Um, Earlier, a very simple measurement. I think what I'm always surprised about is that there is the financial side of the story and the physical or output and outcome side of the story is rarely analyzed together. So you'll have people looking at just the fund flow part to some degree, and then you will have people looking at just what happened with that, and then what happened in terms of how many schools were built, how many toilets were constructed. But very few people are actually looking at the process through which money translates into service delivery. So I think that's been one big reason. I don't think that in India there weren't too many examples of actual process tracking studies. It was something that was relatively new, and it's been evolving a little bit now. But I think there's also this fear in terms of too much information can also be dangerous, even within government. So um, an entire debate in terms of who's collecting it, and for what comes into question as well. Some states are sometimes hesitant to share too much information with the union government. So the question is, when we are talking about what's happening with that 100 rupees, who's asking that question? Um, and in some ways, where does that accountability lie? So I'm not saying that there were probably some people who would know a little bit about what happened to that 100 rupees, but that information was never collated nor ever really made, so definitely not made publicly available, rarely collated and never used. And so you never actually realized almost that you had the power and as in terms of using that information about what happens with that money that you have released onwards.
Got it. And I think I'd be happy to put on my federalist hat and ask you more questions about the center state bits there. But I want to go back to a wide sweep of things just to again give the listener the sense of what's happening, and we can come to PESA as well. So you start here looking at schools in Bihar and building these two aspects of the accountability initiative, the research base, which I would imagine is more structured academic work, let's say, papers and so on, and then what you said you were more interested this partnerships side of things and understanding things from on the ground. So if you could give us a sweep, because AI has grown tremendously then over the years since 2008 and has evolved. Your own role within it has evolved quite a bit over that time. So maybe if we could just understand what happened since with the initiative overall.
So we were doing this work of PESA, like I said, where we were trying to understand local level decision making, bottlenecks that affect citizen engagement. And we realized that this was like I said, something that wasn't really being done at that time. I think one of the things that we saw in some ways when it came to PESA, PESA came at a time in India when much of the work on public expenditure management had either focused on the macro level, which was budget analysis and examining center and state or union government and state level resources, or at the very micro level of examining resources at the service delivery point, so like social audits and things like that. We realized this literally by trial and error that there's very little effort that try to link the two. So the micro level processes to the macro policies. And it kind of started for me when Yamini asked me to do some research, in fact, on can you tell me how much money actually reaches schools and what is the education of the total education budget, what proportion is going to school bank accounts? As at that time being a young RA, I was of course eager to please my new boss and tried very, very hard to try and find answers to that question and realized that not only was there no works around that, it was impossible to answer. So I got training on trying to read budgets. We had a colleague who used to work in National Institute of Public Finance and Policy and IPFP, Anit Mukherjee, who was also partnering with us in this in the PESA project, and he together we would he taught me how to look at budgets and public finance a lot more carefully. I used to spend hours in the NIPFP library. Now at least a lot of the state budgets are online. At that time, there were 7, 8 volumes or maybe even more of thick documents that you had to go through line by line and try and copy onto your laptop. So it was very clear that that information just didn't exist. And that's when we realized that we could fill that gap and try and collect it. So in some ways, PESA starts its work from when money leaves the government treasury. And to answer this question that we were trying to figure out of how much money and what is that, how much reaches school, we realized that we need to understand government functioning. So the links between plans, the links between allocations, expenditures, institutions. So who plans? Is there a link between plans and allocations? How do funds actually flow through the system? So when you're trying to do that, you realize that that 32 desks kind of story, what are the links between the needs at the school level and increased expenditures? Um, and it was in some ways a really exciting time because at that time, at least in India, PETs or public expenditure tracking surveys weren't very common. They had been used successfully in Uganda and there were documented stories of that, but not so much in India. But even then, we were very clear that we had to go beyond just expenditure tracking to more process tracking. So if I had to kind of make that distinction, the difference between expenditure tracking is while the expenditure tracking will tell you how much of that 100 rupees reaches the ground, the process tracking will also tell you a little bit about the how and the why. And so the other new aspect I think that we started working on was that we were actually looking and collecting and analyzing district level data. So now, of course, we've got a lot more focus on the district. We have the district aspirational program and a lot of people working at the district level. But again, during the time, at least, the district was never really studied as an implementation unit. And so that was again exciting. Data, of course, was really, really hard to get. And I remember once visiting a government office and collecting some data from them, from their computer. And then our mistake, my colleague went a week later and recollected that data, apart from additional data. And the two data sets were completely different. And again, was this was not a question of corruption. It was just a question of capacity. There was always adjustments that needed to be made, and very, very genuine ones. So if money doesn't come, you can't stop paying someone's salary. So sometimes you have to take money. Money is fungible, so you take it out of a different budget head, and then you have to adjust it later. And all of these things were very, very real when we started doing work, and we also had to. I think what was really unique for me is we realized that government itself is not this monolithic creature. There are people who are very, very real, who have their own incentives, motivations, and many of them are trying their level best to get things done. But they are also struggling with lack of information, lack of capacity, and their own struggles in terms of being, as Yamini used, cogs in the wheel in some ways of as well. The other thing that I think, again, which was quite unique in our approach is that we were clear that since at the end of the day, we were looking at accountability and information as a critical part of accountability. So for information to be a catalyst for change, people needed to be involved in the process of collecting that information. So we did not rely on survey firms. In fact, there were very few survey firms at that time as well. But we would go to NGOs, students, and citizens who were very, very local. So from the same district or the same block, and actually get them to collect this information. So um, I think we were able to get citizens in that sense to participate in governance processes as well. And I think one of the best thing that we did was partner with Asar Center in our initial days, where we learned a lot about how to do this. And it also allowed us to mobilize a lot of people in the data collection process. In fact, when we were partnering with Asar and coming up with the PESA national reports, which were part of the Asar's own reports, PESA became India's first large-scale citizen-led expenditure tracking survey or process tracking survey. I think the other thing that we learned through this process was that we hadn't seen too much. There were relatively limited efforts to transfer knowledge on how to do this. So how do you create these tools and instruments to generate these regular, reliable, I guess, information on service delivery? So we spent a lot of time in our early days creating posters, creating how-to toolkits, so that anyone could use this methodology in some ways and the principle of it, and try their hand at collecting this information bottom up.
So PESA is today the flagship research program under AI. It stands for Planning, Allocations, and Expenditures, Institution Studies, and Accountability. So it's so the institutionalized version of what you were doing initially with the schools in Bihar would be my understanding. You sort of developed this process and now you use it across a number of different government programs to study them.
Yes. Great that you remember the full form of PESA. I don't think half our colleagues remember it. It's amazing that even now, when our state colleagues go to even government offices and as well as with CSOs, with the catchiness of the acronym, lots of people say, "Oh, PESA wale aa gaye." So we had to spend some time also telling people that we're not people. PESA doesn't mean that we're going to give you money or take money from you, but just it's a long acronym that actually tries to study, as you said, planning, allocations and expenditures, institutions, and studies and accountability. So yes, 2010 PESA started. Since over a period of time, we were able to expand across states. So we even now have full-time colleagues in 5 states of India. And we've managed to use that methodology. So while we started in the education sector, I think we've managed to use that methodology now in different sectors like health, nutrition, sanitation, as well as even in local governments. So at the Gram Panchayat level. It's got its own brand in some ways. Um, I think what was, like if I had to explain what it entailed, there were roughly like 3 steps. First was building evidence and research. So that was a lot of the desk-based work where we would study the 3 Ps, the public finance aspect of it, the processes, and the people. So looking at the different actors. So whatever we could gauge from guidelines, from what is available, from talking to people and the data that exists. Next was collecting, going a little deeper into the administrative data that was available, but also coming up with these tactical, scalable tools where we could actually collect information on gaps that we saw, that at least what we couldn't find from the government documents as well. This was also accompanied by the capacity building initiative to empower citizens. So like I said, it wasn't done through survey firms, but getting citizens to be part of this tracking exercise and use that data collected themselves as well. So we used to have rigorous training. And then finally, we used to share that information not just with the highest levels of bureaucracy, but through the government hierarchy. I think again that was something that was a little unique. Um, there was this earlier. I think there was this feeling that a lot of the policy research or policy rests in Delhi or rests in the state level. But we used to go and speak to from district magistrates to cluster resource coordinators to block level officials to school management committees, sharing with them findings of what we'd found. I remember in December 2015, we had conducted this large scale PESA survey where we had like kind of combined different schemes and studied three schemes together from ICDS at that time. There was Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, and there was Swachh Bharat Mission. And this came, so 2015 was just after since you mentioned fiscal federalism, this was just after 2014 when the Finance Commission had kind of talked about more untied resources to states. So we wanted to understand what's happening with schemes in particular. But when we went to the ground, we found pretty much similar things that we had seen before, which was the structural challenges of the public finance system, who's not receiving their money or not receiving it on time. But we decided that we wanted to, instead of presenting a report to government, we ran something we called PESA dialogues. So the idea of a dialogue was that instead of circulating reports, we would try and share research findings through a dialogue with district and block level implementing officials. And the overall objective was that we can kind of leverage research findings to catalyze the discussion on how to improve implementation. So between May 2016 and I think December 2016, we held a total of 40 such PESA dialogues across our the 10 districts in which we were working. And it was amazing. The kind of response that we got, it forced us also to ask ourselves an important question about where does our role end? Does it end in just identifying the problem, or is it also does it also mean that we need to force ourselves to at least think about what possible solutions could be? So that was a big journey of PESA. We have since then moved towards kind of articulating accountability initiative vision a little bit more from just accountability to responsive governance, but maybe we can come to that later.
I think you described this in a number of other places. Some of it is being financial detection, almost trying to follow this, and the point you make about like sharing it back to government at different levels. One of the key insights, my understanding is that, as you pointed out earlier, that it's not just a matter of us outside government not fully understanding this, but many people within not getting it. And maybe I want to hear a little more about how, one, like you said, people react to the name PESA, but how do governments at different levels see this work? Are they skeptical as they go in? Are they happy to receive it? What sort of responses have you gotten over the years? I know in a number of cases AI is working directly with the governments at different levels in India on this. I'd just like to hear a little more on that.
Sure. So I think we've been lucky that there's been limited skepticism. So I remember speaking to, I think we have this quote somewhere on our website as well, because I felt like the senior official from the elementary education department in Pune and Bihar kind of summarized what we do better than we could at that time. And he described it. Let me just read the quote out to you. So he said, the flow of funds through various levels of the government is very similar to the flow of blood from the heart to various parts of the body. If there's a blockage somewhere, it affects the entire body. So in that regard, PESA studies do the work of a physician. and I think that is it's always what we had hoped would happen, to kind of diagnose where that blockage is and share that with government, because the idea is that we're all trying to, at the end of the day, all of us are trying to ensure that service delivery improves. So it's not so much about, the intent is never to point fingers, but literally emphasize that this is our problem, not just yours, and so that we can have a meaningful discussion on solutions as well. Um, I remember when I was still relatively early. This was about 2013, and we got requests from the Ministry of Human Resource Development, now Ministry of Education, and they came and asked us to undertake a PESA study for the midday meal scheme. And I remember being really confused, and I think I had gained confidence by then to actually ask officers questions. So I remember asking him that, sir, but you already have this information, or even if you don't, it's so easy for you sitting in the ministry to collect this information. You don't need us. You could literally pick up the phone and try and get all the other officers to collect it for you. And I remember so clearly that he turned around and said to me, but as an administrator and a researcher, we have very different lenses. And we're able to gather different sets of information. And I remember him also saying that I don't just want to hear information that people think I want to hear, but I want to be kind of proved right sometimes or proved wrong in my own assumptions. And that's something that has been really heartening. That even when governments often have access to this information, they have seen value in the kind of work that we've been doing. So we've had, I remember again, a district administration coming to us and saying, this was during the time when there was a lot of pressure to meet the Swachh Bharat mission target of October 2019. So there was a lot of construction activities happening on the ground. And I think everyone at that time, or at least the local administrators, knew that some of it was, so while the SDM approach talked about it being a lot more demand-led, focus on behavior change, at that time, which was like the last year almost of the mission, a lot of the focus was just supply and infrastructure. And this official kind of asked us to use our technique to ground truth through actual observations, whether toilets are there, whether they are being used, but also to understand from the service providers what they thought about this campaign. I really like the fact that he was curious to know actually what the CEOs, what like the Gram Panchayat Sarpanch to the block development officer actually thought about the campaign. To what extent did they believe in it and how it had impacted their work? And I remember a video telling us that while he had to look at, in theory, 137 schemes, but during the Swachh Bharat mission, particularly in the last year, all his attention was on this one scheme, which meant that a lot of the other schemes were neglected. So some of these, like, I think it's much easier for people to open up when it's not your boss asking you that question, but someone who is independent, going in as a researcher, having conversations with people about what they do and how they feel and their motivations, their incentives, their means, their opportunities. And I think it's been amazing to some degree how receptive government has been um, for us to kind of come in and help them either think through their own research questions, but also validate, verify, and question.
No, that's really remarkable feedback. You mentioned it between, so I think we'll just grab onto this point. Over the years, you've looked away from the term accountability a little bit, at least internally, and now follow more of a responsive governance mission. So if you could, this touches in with some of the things you've just been talking about, but if you could tell us about more that shift and what was the thinking internally about that transition.
So I think throughout our journey, we were constantly using the learnings to kind of further develop our theory of change. And I think that a critical point for me personally came in 2017 when I took over from Accountability Initiative. In 2018, we would have completed 10 years of our existence. Um, and I think having just taken over from Yamini to lead the initiative, an important question that we were kind of asking ourselves is, where do we go from here? We've had had a successful 10 years, but we want to do more of the same. How do we, in some ways, scale our impact? Um, and I think when we started like kind of doing our own diagnosis, we realized that our strength was our research on understanding the nuts and bolts of implementation. But there was this missing gap between researchers and implementers. In our team also, there was always this little bit of a friction saying, well, should we go out and actually try out pilots? How can we advocate for um, how should we just stop at saying, oh, these are the bottlenecks, but should we push ourselves to actually think of solutions? And I think most of the research organizations, or at least around us, or even actually to some degree in CPR, at least at that time, were focused more on the academic and policy circles. And then there was the CSOs, which often didn't have the tools to use that evidence or the research, nor did they know how to actually navigate the government structures, even constructively to work with government. So we felt like there was this gap and we were kind of one foot here and one foot there. I think it was around the same time where there was a growing body of work that for citizens to effectively participate um, or demand services. It's not just enough to give information to rights and entitlements. It's important for them to learn how to navigate that government system. So I remember works by Jonathan Fox um, and others on doing accountability. I think the paper was called "Doing Accountability Differently," a proposal for vertical integration of civil society monitoring and advocacy. And there were several others, like Gaventa and others, that suggested that for social accountability interventions to actually succeed, you need practitioners to be able to have the tools to navigate that local context better. But you also need the state to not be thought of as this monolithic creature, like I said, but understand what the gaps are in terms of state's own ability and capacity to deliver. So that's when we kind of re-articulated our vision towards responsive governance. I think we kind of used the social accountability definition and applied it to our work, which rests on three pillars. So you need an empowered citizenry, which is able to articulate their voice. You need informed decision makers that are able to develop policies aligned with that citizen voice, as well as having the right service providers who have the right incentives to be able to do their jobs well. And so using that, I think we realized that it's really important for us to work across all three stakeholders. So we provide both government and citizens with access to information on schemes, government functioning, bottlenecks and implementation. For citizens, we also figured out that it's important to provide them tools to allow them to kind of navigate that local state. We work with service providers to build their capacity and kind of recognize those spaces for increased citizen engagement. And then, of course, we also work with governments in identifying the root causes for these implementation failures. We kind of advocate with them for opening up more spaces for citizen engagement, and try and think about what more can be done in terms of reform.
Interesting, and I think be very happy to dig in a bit more. But I've already taken lots of your time, so maybe if you could give us. So then today, you move through like all the levels at AI from the genesis. You're now director, and over time you've seen this shift from looking at accountability from a certain angle to responsive governance. Could you give us a sense of everything that the initiative is doing today? You said earlier that there are projects in 5 states, but there are things beyond PESA also that you work on. And so if you could give us a sense of all of the various things that AI is doing.
Sure. So I think one is, of course, research, which is PESA, but so I think since as I mentioned, PESA is a methodology and a tool. There are times when we do a lot more on the administration side of trying to understand what people's capacity. There are times when we focus a little bit more just on the expenditure side, but our core goal is, of course, to continue looking at process tracking studies. I think another big flagship project for us product in some ways has become the budget brief. Again, it started literally from when Yami asked me that question about help me understand how much money is going for different things in the education sector. And eventually I was able to create like a 2-3 page brief with support from Onit and others. And we felt that just the difficulty in trying to collate and collect that information, which was not available in one place, it required going through multiple government websites. It required sometimes detection work where RTI responses versus what was on the website versus parliamentary answers all had very, very different data, even for the same year. So having gone through that trouble, we felt like it's useful to actually share that with the world, and particularly with members of parliament. Since I think PRS was part of CPR at that time, and we often heard about there's not enough debate, particularly in during budget session and when the budget is passed. So we felt like we could, if we could share what we had learned for the at least the large schemes that we were going to be studying with members of parliament and other decision makers, maybe it would help them get access to knowledge that may not have been easy for them to otherwise access. So we started budget briefs. This year was an anniversary year for us where we completed 15 years of budget brief. So every single year, come rain, come hail, or we've reduced our budget rate. This year, in fact, we did an anniversary issue as well. Since we'd got data for the last 15 years, we were able to look at welfare trends over the last 15 years in the budget analysis. So that's definitely a flagship project that is a part of PESA, but also kind of has its own unique identity in some ways. The second thing that I think we've kind of expanded on in the last few years is our capacity building courses. So I think again a lot of this comes from the fact that we spend a lot of time understanding ourselves on how public finance and administration works and what does government look like. And we felt like it makes sense to then share that information with others. So we have one course called Understanding State Capability, which is an experiential learning program tailored for development professionals and students to unpack India's very, very complicated governance structures. And the idea is that it'll build a community of impactful leaders as well. So we study decentralization, things on budgets, concepts of social accountability, and having been there, done that to some degree of actually not just looking at the theory, but also seeing how it is happens in practice, we're able to kind of give live examples. We also, as in, since I said we work in we have colleagues in 5 states. We realized that we needed to initially at least build their capacity as well. Of they all had a lot of experience of undertaking surveys and things like that, but they didn't necessarily have the theoretical background of government structures, again, of budgets, of fiscal federalism, or even of social accountability. So we ended up training them first, and now they run this program called Hamar Hamari Sarkar. The idea here is that we kind of try and teach civil society organization leaders and practitioners on the ground. And these could be people who are either working with government. So our hope is that by doing this course of trying to unpack this black box of what is Sarkar and what is implementation, they can design appropriate interventions. At times, so we've had different organizations from Pratham, Piramal, some very, very small grassroots organizations also taking our courses. These courses are delivered in Hindi. So it's ideally, like, if the course is held in, we try and hold them in tier 2 city. So if it's held in Patna, our colleagues from Bihar will be actively involved so that the examples are most relevant and local. And we've been very conscious that it's not just a translation of the English program or a translation of research, but it's actually um, trying to see what is most useful for different people who are going to be taking the course. Then we have a course called Hum Sarkari Adhikari, which is for local government actors and institutions. So panchayat secretaries, sarpanches, ward members. We also developed a tool. So it started off, it was earlier a part of our training program. It still is to some degree, but I think now it's kind of an online tool as well called Mapping Governance. So I think in a federal structure like India, where you have decentralization, elected representatives, bureaucrats, quasi-government bodies, all kind of working together, it's understanding what governance or how services are delivered is a challenge in itself. There are informal and formal lines of reporting and accountability. So to kind of we try to map out this governance. So hence the name Mapping Governance. So it's an interactive visual tool that gives a kind of holistic understanding of social sector programs, and it's state specific and sector specific, and it allows us to also look at convergence. So what is the role that WCD has with the education department when it comes to nutrition related programs, or what is the role that the women and child department has with local bodies. So we kind of try and map that entire exercise out. I think the other big change in some ways is that while we were always one for convening and having discussions and dialogues, as I had mentioned earlier as well, um, during the COVID-19 pandemic, I had co-conceptualized with a friend and colleague from Pratham the need for a platform for development partners to come together. And this was, of course, during COVID-19, where there were so many organizations that were doing amazing work, but there was just a lot of the existing platforms focused very much on service delivery on the ground. But what were the research organizations doing? What were the implementing organizations doing, or the funding organizations doing? So kind of bring them all together. So we started this platform called Pulse for development, and Pulse again, of course, has a long name. It stands for Platform to Understand, Learn, Share, and Exchange. And it was in some ways a resource sharing platform initially. I think in 2022, as the pandemic waned, we made a conscious decision to include within it long-standing development issues and shift the focus towards the attainment of the SDGs. So in its present form, Pulse for Development has kind of become like a community of practice where we have cross-pollination of knowledge. We have people, I think now there are about nearly 100 member organizations to, I think, almost 200 individual practitioners. This includes even young IS officers and state cadre officers, as well as, like I said, implementing organizations, research organizations, think tanks, funders, grassroots organizations. So the idea is to have an interdisciplinary pan-India community of practice, and we cover 16 themes, and we often have regular coffee chats on critical issues that different organizations are working on. So it's an opportunity for organizations and the government to kind of learn from each other. And it's been really interesting. We've had, I remember one session where we had different government officers sharing who work in difficult geographies, but at the same time, very, very different states. So someone from Arunachal, someone from Maharashtra, someone from Odisha. But when they started talking about some of the challenges that they were all facing, you could see this exchange of ideas of, that's what you've done. That sounds really interesting. Would love to learn more about it. So we ourselves as kind of think of ourselves as kind of reducing the learning curve for organizations and government by kind of being this repository, but also facilitating this interaction and engagement between government on one hand and different types of organizations on another.
No, I think this set of things from Hum or Hamari Sarkar to mapping governance and so on really gives us a good good understanding of also what you meant when you said earlier that you wanted to be a bit more than just evidence creation. There's so much more direct activity, whether it's with governments or with civil society, that you get a sense of beyond an itself insightful methodology to understand public finance. And I can say this as as someone who worked in the journalism space. The budget briefs were always invaluable, and we don't have the time on this conversation to get into actually some of the details in your own analytical writing and work on that. But I'd encourage anyone listening to go check out particularly this year's 15-year look back at how public finances, social welfare spending has evolved. It's super insightful. We'll put links in the show notes. We're starting to run out of time here, so maybe we'll come to the final set of questions we like to put all on this interview series. Maybe first up, and this is one that that you can be, it covers some of the things we've already spoken about. But what misconceptions about your area of work, about accountability, about public finance, about welfare spending, also about studying government, do you find yourself having to correct all the time, whether it's from the lay public or even fellow scholars or people within government?
I think biggest misconception on accountability is that it's a fault-finding mission. I remember sitting in a government meeting where they heard the name of the initiative and were like, "Oh, then I have to be careful about what I say." Then when they learned what we do, they were like, "Oh, you mean the good kind of accountability?" And I didn't actually know that there was a bad kind of accountability. So I think it's not a fault-finding mission. It's also not just external. It's as much internal. It's accountability to ourselves to be able to do our jobs that we want to do to the best of our ability. Also that it's not just vertical. It's not that I'm accountable just to my boss. I'm equally accountable to people below me, but it's also equally horizontal. So how do I interact with my peers and with other stakeholders? So, and I think the other misconception is that we're all kind of embedded in this complex set of relationships. So accountability is complicated, and so is governance. And so there is no black and white. There's often a lot of gray. I think that's one big misconception about our work. That it's, so I wanted to just repeat. It's not a fault finding mission. It's not someone externally trying to lay blame and point fingers at all. I think on public finance, I think one of the biggest misconceptions was that, and I think probably for myself as well, when I first started, that it's a very technical skill or it's a very technical concept. But I think since I hadn't actually got formal training on public finance and literally learned on the job, I've learned that using a public finance lens can tell you a lot about people, about institutions, about federal relations, whether it's center state dynamics or state and local government dynamics. It tells you a lot about who has decision-making power based on kind of the concentration of financing on funding. So it's actually super interesting, and it's a lens in some ways that you can kind of use in your work. So it's not just data crunching, it's not just numbers, it's not just technical skill set. I think whenever we're, I think as colleagues, when we are kind of, there are times when you do the mundane data kind of crunching and more than that data entry often. But it's when you're trying to kind of look at the stories and what it's telling you, that's where it's definitely super exciting and can get really interesting.
Great, and maybe that sort of leads into my next question, which is, what advice would you have to young scholars entering this space? I'm particularly interested in, not so much questions of PhD or not PhD or things like that, but whether there are tools or lenses, as you said, or approaches that you found most useful, that you would recommend to someone who's interested in entering this area.
I think that the world now is so competitive that the younger generation is already often looking for specialization. I see young 20-year-olds who are, at least in their CVs, specialists in different skills. But I think my advice would be there's always time to pick specialties. But initially, you should just be building your knowledge and understanding your issue through different lenses. If I go back to the question, the interview, how we started, where my history background actually helped me understand economics better and led me to a public policy world. It's I do think that the liberal arts degree of actually even studying philosophy, I loved philosophy in college as well. All of these kind of are things that you never know when you'll use it. The other thing that I would say is I think listening to different scholars speaking across topics really helps, and I think that's been one of the great parts of CPR where we have people across different walks of life talking about different aspects of their work. I do think, and maybe that's my bias a little bit, is that I think that in today's day and age, some data proficiency. I don't mean that you need to be a statistician, but some data proficiency is useful. Um, just because I think it, I think it helped me become more structured in my argument. Because the second you're working with data, it forces you to be more organized, be more structured, and also not take anything at face value, because you could slice the data in different ways and you could get very different answers and results. So it kind of, for all of those aspects, I would say that I think some understanding of data, and I don't mean by data, I don't just mean quantitative data. It could even be heaps of qualitative data, is really useful.
Yeah, I think I'd be happy to direct anyone who's working in this space to get a little bit of dose of philosophy every once in a while. I think you have to deal with numbers all the time. It's a nice little. You need that bump every once in a while. So just the final two questions. Then we spoke about the 15-year look back. We spoke about some of the work, and of course, a lot of the work that AI does in a way doesn't turn out in terms of papers and documents. A lot of it is on ground. It's in your initiatives, but for someone who's listened to this, or read this, and who's interested, are there specific pieces either for AI or of your own work? Because we didn't again discuss this much, but Avani writes regularly and does analytical work both at the academic level and in op-eds and so on. So, are there any things you'd like to direct people to as either things you particularly like that encapsulate your work, or that you think would be valuable for someone who's interested in this conversation?
So I think definitely, as you said, budget briefs and the 15-year trends. It kind of, if you don't have time to go through individual budget briefs, the 15-year trends kind of puts it all together. The other paper I think would be one that I did with Yamini. I think it's called Centralization versus Decentralization. The Centralization versus Decentralization tug of war, and the emerging narrative of fiscal federalism for social policy in India. The reason I would say it is that in some ways it encompassed some of the inherent tensions in our fiscal federal framework. It gave me the opportunity to both use the quant skills, but it was fascinating that I got a chance to go and talk to finance officers and planning officers across different states. And it kind of brings out this tension a little bit. So that was a fun exercise to do, and is a relatively easy read. I think there are two, maybe we did one for CPR policy challenges, which kind of forced me to look at everything that I have kind of understood on centrally sponsored schemes and social policy, and kind of put it together in one place. So that may be a easy snapshot summary of some of the lessons that we have learned through our PESA work and through our work at Accountability Initiative.
Great. I think we'll try and put links to each of these in the show notes. And then finally, what three works, whether they're books, What three works have influenced you personally?
This is a very difficult question because I think at different avatars and different times of my life, and I've been influenced by different works. So um, I I will cheat and not just stick to three. But I think I think in college I was deeply affected by Paul Farmer's Pathologies of Power in my undergraduate days, and I think that kind of pushed me into like kind of wanting to work in the development sector a lot more. Um, so that definitely ranks high. And I also mentioned Hirschman's Exit Voice and Loyalty. So that was another big one. Cliche, but I think Why Nations Fail um, by Asimoglu and Robinson and Development is Freedom by Professor Amartya Sen. Again, all of these kind of propelled me into the public policy space. I think when I joined CPR um, on accountability, I think Jonathan Fox's work, where he kind of explains the sandwich strategy, we use that in our courses as well. So that's been really influential for us. And as someone who is starting to understand intergovernmental fiscal transfers, I would highly recommend Robert Broadway and Anwar Shah's book on intergovernmental fiscal transfers principles and practice. It's very long, but it's got nice, clean sections, so you can pick and choose what you want to do. But it's kind of like an encyclopedia of um, everything you want to know on intergovernmental fiscal transfers. Um, there was of course also I think when I joined CPR, not I think not when I joined actually halfway through CPR, I think the Rethinking Public Institutions in India by Devesh Kapur, Pratap and Milan, Pratap Bhanumehta and Milan Vaishnav was again super interesting. And I think what I like about edited volumes is that you get to learn a lot from very, very different perspectives. Um, yeah, so these would be some of the top ones. And I think what I also enjoyed recently, for someone who's just starting out and doesn't necessarily want to get too technical, I think there are a large number of books where you get a glimpse of the welfare state or glimpse of public policy without necessarily feeling like you're kind of studying it. I recent works like M. Rajshekhar's Despite the State, Why India has let its people down and how they cope, was really fascinating and easy read. And similarly, I think Ajay Shah and Vijay Kirkar's In Service of the Republic, I think The Art and Science of Economic Policy. And I recently saw on his blog that it's also a course now in Coursera, parts of the book. So that I would encourage people to look at that.
Wonderful. No, I think that's a nice mix between things that would be more accessible and then what you described as everything you need to know about intergovernmental fiscal transfers, which is not something that I think has wide readership, but I'm sure is vital for those in the field. Great. Thank you so much, Avani. We've covered lots of ground. I think we could go on for another couple of hours easily, but this has been fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rohan. This was fun.
Thank you for listening to CPR Perspectives. Subscribe to this podcast feed for future interviews, and you can also sign up to our newsletter, which will be linked in the show notes. For more information on CPR's work, you can follow the Centre on Twitter at CPR_India and log on to the website at www.cprindia.org. I'm at Rohan V on Twitter, and you can also read my newsletter India Inside Out on Indian politics, foreign policy, and history at rohanvenkat.substack.com.